Hey, what's up folks? This is Torches, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about my post-processing graphic overlays for the Elder Scrolls Online. What I'd like to do today is just talk a little bit about the filters that I use and why I use them. I figure I'll start with anything that may need explaining, and then I'll go ahead and just walk you through the different parameter values, so anyone that doesn't want to hear me ramble on can just skip to that point there and use some of the presets for yourself. I'll go ahead and leave the timestamp in the description. Now, I want to preface this with a couple different things because if you've never done this before, it may help you to understand how these things work. To my knowledge, there are mainly two big ways to go about enhancing your graphics in the Elder Scrolls Online. One being Reshade, which is a graphic enhancement mod for ESO that you can install, and it has tons of pretty awesome post-processing options that you can use, and also some cool presets that you can download and install if you're not feeling savvy with the settings yourself. The second one being what I'm using here today, which is the GeForce Experience graphic overlay that they call Freestyle. Essentially, this is just a series of filtering options that you can lay right on top of the game and make it look better. I already love how this game looks from a graphic standpoint, but I have to say that enhancing the graphics of the Elder Scrolls Online has just made my playing experience that much more enjoyable, especially when it comes to more immersive environments like story and questing. I personally like GeForce's Freestyle overlay over Reshade for a couple different reasons. One being, for anyone who doesn't know, I like to do what they call screenshot art in my spare time, where I essentially take screenshots of places that I think are awesome in game and then just beef them up in Photoshop. I found that Freestyle is a much better on-the-fly dynamic option, where I've found myself tinkering with Reshade for far too long to be effective when I could just make very similar tweaks in Photoshop and post. This isn't at all to say that Reshade isn't awesome, but I think it's more the kind of thing that, you set and forget. For someone who needs to constantly make tweaks and such, I've found Freestyle to be better. And secondly, it's also much more user-friendly. The UI is really simple and it doesn't take much to start playing around with this. Whereas Reshade takes some time and some Googling to find the information you need to get to a point where things are looking pretty. And lastly, while I can't speak for Reshade simply because I haven't tested it enough, I've noticed almost zero effect on frame rates and performance using Freestyle running a GeForce GTX 1070, which is pretty middle of the road at this point. So to start with GeForce Freestyle, you just need to have the GeForce Experience installed, which many of you with NVIDIA cards already will, and you'll need to have the overlay enabled. Now, I'm not running this in full screen, so just so I can jump in between windows easily if needed, but this does work in full screen or windowed. So first, I'd open up your GeForce Experience app just to make sure you have overlay turned on. So you can just hop over to settings and you'll see in-game overlay turned on. You'll also see a hotkey here, which I have mine set to Alt-G. I think it's Alt-Z by default. And you also just want to make sure that your system can handle Freestyle here, right? And that's pretty much it for that. So once you're set with that, pop over to your game and hit your hotkey for your overlay. Then we want to go to Game Filter up here, which also can be accessed by hitting Alt F3. So you'll get this little sidebar where you can start adding filters and editing your game display. There are 4 big options here that I want to talk about. That are pretty much the meat and potatoes of all 3 of these presets, right? First, let's talk about Painterly. Painterly is essentially a filter that gives your game a painted kind of effect, if you couldn't already guess. But the brilliant thing about this effect is not that we're trying to actually accomplish a painted look, but I find that it does a really excellent job of smoothing out some of the textures. ESO is already an amazing looking game. I've always loved how it looks. But one thing I've noticed for some time, especially when doing screenshot edits, is how noisy it can be at times. I find especially with leaves and textured surfaces, this choice can make your game look quite a bit smoother if you dial it in correctly. And it also gives a slight film grain kind of effect, which is really nice. And not for nothing, I've noticed a lot of the newer games coming out utilizing similar effects. I noticed in Borderlands 3, in the Outer Worlds, it's been a relatively popular art style lately, and it lends itself really nicely here too. It's important to note that these filters do also affect your game's UI, so it takes a little bit of tweaking with Painterly specifically to get it to a good point where everything is still legible. We use it pretty minimally, and I'll walk you through the settings that I have it set to shortly, but just something to watch out for if you go ahead and mess with the settings yourself. It just acts as sort of a strategic removal of noisy details. So then the last three filters are honestly pretty self-explanatory. We have color, brightness, contrast, and details. And I'm not going to go into crazy detail with these as they're pretty self-explanatory, but if you have any comments or concerns, you can go ahead and leave a comment below, and I'll do my best to address it. So within color, we have a few settings here to adjust the temperature and saturation of the display. And in contrast brightness, we have some sliders to mess with the levels of the lights and darks. And in details, we have basically some settings to sharpen the image or add bloom and such to control the kind of overall ambience and detail that the game gets. And that's pretty much all we're going to be using. So without further ado, let's walk through these. The main three that I use are these three here, and you don't really get the the option to name them, but I've sort of committed them to memory. Essentially, the first one is just kind of a warmness. It's rather warm. The middle one is kind of more loyal to the game's natural feel. And the last one, which is my personal favorite, is kind of a bleak, exaggerated kind of look, right? You have to keep in mind these may not look like much in one specific environment, but we have so many different environments and biomes to account for with this game. An overly bright preset may look great here. We're in the Tribunal Temple in Mournhold, but it may be overkill in a place like Somerset or something. So these are all kind of tested to look good, but also have a high success rate in as many different places as possible. So let's start with number one, right? And I'll give you just kind of a comparison here, right? The warm one I tend to use most because I feel like it makes the game look really nice without being too intense. I find that the Elder Scrolls in general to be a rather cold franchise, lots of blues and grays. I think this added warmth really adds a lot to the game's overall feel. The second one here, I'll just do a quick little comparison. It's very similar, but it's nice because it smooths out some of the textures and adds some bloom, but it doesn't really affect the coloring much at all. This one is great for me if I find a specific area that I already really appreciate the color grading there, or I have a specific idea for an edit. I can retain what's there color-wise while still smoothing out the look a little bit. And lastly, which is my personal favorite, is the sort of bleak look, right? The bleak look, this one I find a lot of fun to experiment with, and it's been the most immersive. While it's not always entirely practical for very objective-based gameplay like PvP or serious PvE, it's so much fun to quest with this on. It desaturates some of the color and exaggerates the highlights and shadows a bit in a way that makes the game feel more intense. Like at nighttime, it really is dark in the sense that the lighting in the world is really what's guiding you around, and it really makes the game as a whole feel much more dramatic, right? So I'm going to walk you through these settings on each of these so you can copy them if you'd like, starting with the warm preset, right? Just a note too, I don't think the order of these matter too much. I've noticed, abysmal changes in kind of moving them around, but for the most part, they stay pretty, it keeps everything pretty much the same. So number one, this is the warm preset. Painterly, I have iterations at 1, sample directions at 4, radius at 3, edge sharpness at 100%. Color, we have tint color at 92%, tint intensity at 14%, temperature at around 14, vibrance at around 10. Brightness and contrast, we have exposure at 0, contrast at 5%, highlights at 21, shadows at -18, gamma at 0. Then we have just a little bit of darkness around the edges. That's all that does there. I have that about 18%. And details, we have sharpen at 30%, clarity at 25, HDR toning at -42, and bloom at 20. So that's the warm preset right here. And we'll just run around a little bit so you can see. Looks nice. Kind of makes everything look a little bit warmer. So number 2, this one is pretty, color-wise, it pretty much retains the color of the base game. It just adds some bloom and smoothness to it, right? So the color, starting down here, we have the tint color at 88%, tint intensity at 8%, temperature, keeping it at right about 0, and vibrance at about 10. Brightness contrast, we have exposure at 0, contrast at 5%, highlights at 3, shadows at 25%, and gamma at 10. For the details, we have sharpen at 16%, clarity at 31, HDR toning at -64, bloom at 28. And for painterly, we have iterations at 1, sample directions at 4, radius at 3, and edge sharpness at 100. You're pretty much going to notice that this painterly here is always going to be generally the same. If you like this effect, you can up it to 4 or 5, and it still looks pretty cool. You get a lot more of that painted kind of look. And if you're not really a fan of this, you can bring it down to 1 or 2, and it still kind of smooths out the textures, and you don't really notice the effect much at all. In this case, we're really just using it to kind of smooth things out. You almost don't notice the painted look at all whatsoever, right? So that's the more natural kind of look. And the last one, which is sort of the bleak, dramatic look, right? So color, we have tint color at 92%, tint intensity at 30, temperature at 12, vibrance at -35. Then brightness and contrast, exposure we're at 0, contrast we're at 31, highlights we're at -20, shadows we're at 15, gamma is at 0. Details, sharpen is at 30%, clarity is at 15, HDR toning is at -24, and bloom is at 34. And painterly, we have iterations at 1, sample directions at 4, radius at 3, and edge sharpness at 100%. And again, you can play with this radius depending on how little or how much you want that smoothing that painterly does, right? And that's pretty much it, right? Just to compare these with the base game, here's the base game without any filters on it. And here's 3, here's 2, and here's 1, right? And there you have it. So, I mean, I've always loved the look of this game, and honestly, these little graphic enhancements have made the game so much more enjoyable for me. The Elder Scrolls has always been such an immersive universe, but in a large-scale multiplayer setting, I think it's just hard for it to compete with its single-player predecessors from a graphic standpoint. So these are the ways that I've found that you can kind of start to bring some of that back. But anyway, thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these presets, and I will catch you all next time.